Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, which is a part of the knowledge building segment of our results at the community level open learning community group here at the Learning Communities Resource Center. We are excited about today's presentation related to collective impact, and we're going to say a little bit more about that momentarily. However, as we begin our conversation today, just want to provide a little bit of context for us. And so as I mentioned, this presentation today is a part of our results at the community level learning community group, which has really been a series of webinars which up to this point has been focused on helping community action agencies or our network learn a little bit more about what community level work is, what it is not, also to sort of think about examples of community level work, and then to begin to identify elements of how to measure and report on community level work using our MPIs. And as we know, with the exploration of Roma Next Gen and our CSBG performance management framework over the past years, we've really been called to a deeper level of engagement and really a refocusing of our resources towards community level needs that ultimately, without addressing those, limit our ability to advance outcomes on that family or individual level. And so today we are very excited about the presentation that we will hear about, because it really provides an opportunity for a deeper understanding of that maximal coordination that can take place on the community level through collective impact, and really its ability or potential to not only maximize outcomes but sustain them over time. So with that said, I'd like to also ground our conversation today in the promise of community action, and that promise is community action changes people's lives, embodies the spirit of hope, improves communities, and makes America a better place to live. We care about the entire community, and we're dedicated to helping people help themselves and each other. And so with that said, let's take a quick look at today's agenda. We'll provide you a little more background information about the learning community itself, and provide some introductions, particularly introducing our wonderful subject matter experts from FSG, who will not only be talking today about collective impact, but have a series of web presentations that they will be providing this group over the course of the next several months. We will have an opportunity to receive an example from the field on collective impact from Shared Prosperity in Philadelphia, and then you all as participants will have an opportunity to engage in questions, and we will be available to respond to those questions that you have. And what I would ask is if you have questions, like as they come to you, go ahead and formulate those in the chat window, and we will collect those for the end of today's presentation and respond to those as efficiently as possible. The other thing that I would like to point out is that the purpose of the learning community is to build the CSBG network's capacity to fight poverty more effectively, and really it's around finding those promising practices that really begin to break the foundation of those causes and conditions of poverty that pervade throughout our country. And as we think about those causes of poverty, really that community level work coincides a great deal with that particular focus. And the other thing to point out is that we are very much informed by the National Community Action Theory of Change, and one of our key goals, it's goal number 2, that says that it's goal number 3 that says that we will basically promote people with low income, basically that they're engaged in building opportunities in community. I didn't say that right. So people with low incomes are engaged in and active in building opportunities in communities. And so one of our major pillars within our theory of change points to our commitment to engage in that community level work. As a collective, we work together to mobilize communities to fight poverty in this work. And so with that said, as we look very quickly at the next slide, it just provides you with a listing of all of the learning community group opportunities within the learning community. As I've said, the results at the community level group is one of those. And what I will say in addition is a lot of the knowledge building for all of these groups is available to our network at all times. And so we meet very often, so every Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time with what we call Webinar Wednesdays. Today's session is one of those Webinar Wednesday presentations. And so in addition to the results at the community level content, you have access to content related to all of the groups highlighted on this slide. And even if you're not able to attend the live presentations, the recordings are all available on the partnership website as well as LCRC Web, which is the learning community blog. The other thing that I will point out to us is that our framework is very much informed by our performance management assumptions that have to do with thinking about how we collect data, report on that, and analyze that data. Additionally, we aim to interweave concepts related to family-centered coaching, trauma-informed approaches, and racial equity into our larger focus areas within the learning community. At the end of the day, we are committed to, like I said, building the network's capacity so that it might fight poverty more effectively. And through our various engagements within the learning community, we're hoping that the small actions that we take, ultimately impact all of you, and collectively all of you have an opportunity to make some big change in the lives of families and communities. And the final thing that I will call out is that the learning community itself, it covers 33 states within our nation and all 11 of our regions. And so we're just excited just about the scale of potential impact. The final thing that I'll say before I make an introduction of our subject matter experts today is that all of this work can't be done without the collective effort of the LCRC team, whom you see listed on the screen. And of course, I am Tiffany Marley. I'm the project director. I'm joined today in the production role by my colleague Hyacinth McKinley. And you can see all of the wonderful faces and names of other team members who play a vital role in sustaining the work of this project. And so, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce today's webinar presentation, which is really an introduction to collective impact, and it is being facilitated by our wonderful colleagues from FSG. In particular, we have Robert Albright, who is the Director of Programs of the Collective Impact Forum, as well as Jennifer Juster, who is the Executive Director of the Collective Impact Forum, FSG. And so they really are the experts in the field as far as we are concerned, and really understand in a deep way what it means to mobilize communities around a common agenda to achieve goals that really have the potential, as I said, to maximize those outcomes and sustain outcomes that will ultimately elevate outcomes on the family and community levels. And so with that said, I'm going to hand off to you, Jennifer and Robert. We thank you for joining us today.
Great. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting us to join, and I know Robert and I are delighted to be with you today. So let's see. Here I am taking control of the slides. So as we mentioned, my name is Jennifer. I'm the Executive Director of the Collective Impact Forum, and I am being joined by my colleague, Robert Albright, today. We, as we mentioned, sit within a program in the larger nonprofit organization called FSG, and our program, the Collective Impact Forum, is actually a partnership between FSG and the Aspen Institute's Forum for Community Solutions. And what brings us to this call and this area of work are three different kinds of work that our organizations do. And the reason I mention this is just to give you a little bit of a sense of what kind of work and research has contributed to all of the content that you'll be hearing today. So FSG, our parent or our umbrella organization, does hands-on support of communities that are doing collective impact work. So we've done this across a broad range of issues, which you see on the left side of your screen, ranging everything from health issues like childhood obesity and substance use to other issues like juvenile justice, education work, and community development work. In addition to working directly with communities, my colleagues and I do what we call thought leadership, which is essentially research and writing on different topics, including collective impact as one of the main areas of our work. Then finally, we have our learning community, and that is what we call the work of the Collective Impact Forum itself. Robert and I and a few of our colleagues are solely dedicated to doing capacity building for people in the field who are using collective impact or interested in learning more about collective impact. So let's go on to the next slide. Hyacinth, my computer is acting up a little bit and not letting me forward, so I'm going to actually ask you to take control of the slide advancing, if you wouldn't mind, and move us on to the next slide. If you've already done so, unfortunately, I can't see that on my interface, so maybe you could just give me a verbal prompt.
Yes, Jennifer, so we have advanced slides. Thank you.
Okay, great. Let me just pull up my hard copy given my tech issues, and I apologize. So here we have our next slide is a poll. Great, I'm live again. Thank you so much. So we want to just start by hearing a little bit about how familiar you are with the idea of collective impact. So we're going to launch a poll over on your screen. You can see it on the right-hand side. How familiar are you with the collective impact approach? Not familiar, heard the term, know the collective impact approach, but not currently involved in a collective impact collaboration, or I am currently involved in a collective impact collaboration. So we'll give you a few minutes to answer that, then we'll see who's on the line. All right, so whenever we're ready, we can check out those results. Terrific. So we see a mix of folks across the board, ranging from I've heard the term collective impact, but not sure how it differs from other partnerships. That is the majority of respondents, to not at all familiar, and a couple of folks who are actually deeply involved in the work or know a little bit more. So this is great. We're so glad you joined, and we will tailor our comments accordingly as we go. So let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so when we talk about collective impact, it's helpful to think a little bit about the kinds of situations or the kinds of problems that do make sense for collective impact work. The first is a simple problem. And the example that you see on your screen is baking a cake. So let's think about this type of problem. This is a problem that has a straightforward recipe that can be followed, and every time you follow that recipe, you get the same result over and over. So if you have the recipe and a colleague has the recipe, you can pretty much expect that if you follow that recipe, you'll get the same result. Let's go to the next example, which is a complicated problem. And the example here is sending a rocket to the moon. Now, certainly this is not simple, and it takes more than just a recipe. It takes complicated technology often, high degrees of training, and sophisticated technology and materials. However, with those training and with the right information and materials, you probably can also replicate and succeed in doing the task at hand. So not everybody can do this, but again, with the right training and technology, it is possible to repeat the process of sending a rocket to the moon in different contexts with the same information and materials. So let's go on to the next one, which would be a complex problem. And the example here is raising a child. And certainly, as a mother of 2 little ones, I can relate to the complexity of raising a child. And what we're really talking about with raising a child are situations where there is not a simple formula or recipe. And if you have one thing that works in one situation, for example, with one child, you're not always going to get the same exact result if you do the same thing again. You also have many different influences that impact the outcomes, such as with raising a child, education and health and socio-emotional development and the faith community and other communities. And all of these different influences will inform what it means to raise a child. And not only can you think about all those different factors, but you definitely need to think about the interaction between those different factors as well. And so when we think about complex problems, those are problems where you can't easily replicate a solution. You have to pay attention to many different factors, as well as all of the connections between those different influences. And so if you could just forward one click, what we often see is that the social sector treats problems as simple or complicated, so like baking a cake or sending a rocket to the moon, but we often find ourselves in situations that are truly complex and need solutions that are meant for complex situations. So let's go to the next slide. So when we're talking about more traditional approaches to solving complex problems, we often find ourselves working in more isolated ways. And in these situations, funders, whether those are philanthropic funders or government funding, tends to select individual organizations, grantees, or programs. And then based on the way the funding works, they are often incentivized to work separately and to compete with each other. And certainly, even if they're not incentivized to work separately, they're not incentivized necessarily to work together. Then we also have often a disconnect between government and the social sector, or the private sector, the role of business and the social sector in moving social outcomes. And then we often also find that evaluations try to isolate the particular organization's impact. And if we do see something that looks successful from an evaluation, we often depend on trying to scale that individual organization, which poses many challenges. That assumes that you can scale a solution in a different context. It takes out of the equation the leaders and the staff that might have contributed to that success. And so always relying on scaling a program or an organization isn't necessarily a solution that's going to get us to the results that we want to see. So let's move to the next slide. So if we think about moving towards a different approach, a collective approach, we want to think about creating situations where organizations can come together and work together from across the different sectors and the community. So we're talking about residents, government, nonprofits, philanthropic organizations, and often businesses as well, integrating the work that they do so that they are coordinated in service of that bigger picture goal. And they're actively coordinating not only their work, but they're sharing what's working and what's not. Finally, we find it really helpful if all these organizations can have a shared understanding of the goal that they're trying to accomplish. And so this is what we call collective impact. And let's move to the next slide where we have a formal definition of collective impact. And this is the definition that was put forth by some of our colleagues at FSG in the article Collective Impact in the original article in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. Collective impact is the commitment of a group of important actors from different sectors to a common agenda for solving a specific social problem. And I'll say a few things on this slide. First, I will say that while this is the definition that was coined, if you will, in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, this was certainly not a new concept for many communities, and this was not created or invented by the Collective Impact Forum or FSG or our colleagues, but rather this is a framing and a language that was given to work that was happening in many communities, and the field has told us that it's been very helpful to have this shared framework and some shared terminology that Robert and I will be speaking to in order to understand what it is in particular about some successful collaborations that have been working in order for people to learn from each other and put this work into place. So with that said, the definition that has really helped shape this cohesive field of collective impact is here on the screen. What we're talking about, a couple different pieces here. We're talking about a commitment. Now, that means that the people that are collaborating are not doing so off the side of their desk. They are not just coming together every now and then for a conversation. They are committing to the goals of the collaborative and how their work may need to shift and how they might contribute in order to contribute to that broader goal. We're talking about different sectors, as I already mentioned. We're talking about residents and the community. We're talking about nonprofits and other agencies. We're talking about philanthropy and the private sector and government, all bringing their relevant assets to bear to move toward a common goal. And then common goal is defined as part of the common agenda, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. And we're talking about solving a specific social problem at scale. And when we talk about a specific problem, this means that the collaborative knows what it's trying to accomplish, has a concrete goal, and a time frame by which they're looking to accomplish that goal. So while while the overall mission might be something related to improving education, we are talking about a specific goal, like doubling the high school graduation rate by the year 2020. So that is what we're talking about when we talk about a specific social problem. All right, let's go to the next slide, which is really the heart of what differentiates collective impact from other forms of collaboration from an operational perspective. So you see 5 different things on the screen that we call the conditions of collective impact. And this is really when our colleagues at FSG scanned the field and saw a range of successful cross-sector collaborations that were achieving population-level impact. These are the things that they saw in common across the different collaboratives. So let's start with the first one, the common agenda. The common agenda is more than just a mission or a goal statement. It begins with a common understanding of the problem or the opportunity that the group is coming together to solve. Without that shared understanding of what the context is and what the root causes are and what the baseline is, it's hard to really move towards action. So starting with that shared understanding of the situation, then working towards a shared vision for change. In that, as I already mentioned, we like to think about a time frame for the work, a concrete goal for the work, and a sense of what the group is going to do to pursue that goal. So for example, if we're talking about an initiative focused on education, I already mentioned an example, let's say doubling the high school graduation rate by the year 2020. In addition, in a common agenda, we want to see the specificity around the time frame and the number. We also like to see some focus on how we can address equity in that common agenda. So in this case, part of the common agenda, in addition to doubling the high school graduation rate, is an explicit commitment to closing the achievement gap in the process. So I just walked through that as an example of the level of specificity that's helpful in the shared vision and the goal. In addition, I mentioned thinking about the different components of the work as part of a common agenda. So in that education example, you would see the work broken down into different sub-pieces. You would see a focus on early childhood. You might see another focus on reading by 3rd grade. You might see another commitment to supporting kids in their out-of-school time and programs. And then, of course, there might be a few other areas of focus all building towards that goal around high school graduation. So we'll give a couple more examples as we go, but that's what we're talking about specifically with a common agenda. The second here is called shared measurement. Shared measurement is the idea that the partners in the collaborative all agree to a certain set of measures that they will track in the same way consistently over time. Now, this is not saying that all of the partners change their entire measurement and evaluation systems to be identical, but rather that there are, let's say, 5 to 10 key measures that everyone is tracking in the same way. Sometimes this comes from publicly available data that everybody has access to and agrees is the important data set to monitor. So something like those high school graduation rates, or something like employment rates that are published. In some cases, though, there are data sets that aren't publicly available that everyone agrees is important, and different participants commit to collecting that data using a shared tool in the same way. And part of the benefit in those situations is that it enables greater learning across the participants if all of the groups doing similar work are measuring and tracking their problem in the same way, their data in the same way. So an example of that and the power of coming to that shared understanding that I'd like to share comes from a collective impact initiative that is focused on the juvenile justice system in the state of New York. And this is a situation where the collaborative was actually operating at a state level, and they came together to really improve outcomes for youth that were being impacted by the juvenile justice system. And one of the priority goals that they set was reducing recidivism rates across the state. However, when they went to define recidivism, it turned out that there were multiple different definitions and ways of measuring recidivism across different agencies. And so they took it upon themselves to align their definition and the way that they were measuring recidivism in their work so that they could actually aggregate that data and more deeply understand the work each other was doing, because the outputs and the outcomes that they would be sharing would actually be apples to apples, if you will. So having that shared definition is incredibly useful and important for learning, for performance management, and for accountability. The third area here is mutually reinforcing activities. And this really means the coordination and differentiation of the work that happens as a result of the collaborative coming together. So in some cases, it means new partnerships are forming, new coordination is happening. In some cases, it means people are working together to advocate for policy change or practice change or shifts in resources. Or in some cases, it means that once you have all of the relevant organizations in a room, or the relevant community members in a room, you realize that there are significant gaps in services that are being offered, and the collaborative can then take to addressing and filling where those gaps lie. So different kinds of work happen within mutually reinforcing activities, but this is really how the group together pursues making progress toward the common agenda, in addition, of course, to the work that all of the organizations are already doing on a daily basis. Fourth, continuous communication. This, I'd like to talk about both the formal and the informal communication that is important in collective impact. So from a formal perspective, these collaboratives meet typically frequently, often monthly, if not more, to really move the work forward and have active formal types of communication as a result. But also, perhaps of equal importance is the trust and the relationships that are built as a result of the collaborative and lead to more organic communication. And then finally, the backbone support. And from a structural perspective, this is one of the pieces that most differentiates collective impact from other collaborations. In collective impact, we see dedicated staff to facilitating the work of the collaborative itself. And this, in some smaller collaboratives that have might not have as many resources, this could be part of a person's time, but in many cases it's between 1 and 5 people who are solely dedicated to the work of the collaborative. That means they're convening the meetings, they're facilitating relationships, they're guiding the collaborative towards progress. We'll talk a little bit more about them on the backbone role on a future webinar, but the point that I think is really important here is that the backbone does not drive the work on its own. The backbone does not set the agenda on its own. The backbone is the key guide and facilitator of the work of the collaborative. So that is, in a nutshell, an overview of the definition of collective impact and the 5 conditions of collective impact that really structurally differentiate it from other approaches to collaboration. With that, I'm going to actually hand it over to Robert to take us through some more content.
Great. Thanks, Jen. It's good to talk to everybody today. I'm really looking forward to the conversation, and appreciate Jen setting it up and Tiffany also providing the introduction, and just really looking forward to this conversation. I had a chance to meet several of you actually probably on the line at a conference through the Southeast Association of Community Action Agencies a couple of years ago, and just came away from that meeting just really interested in the work that you all are doing, and clearly many of you have been working in this space of effective collaboration for quite a while, so I'm excited to hear your questions in just a minute. As Jen said, I'm going to pick up the baton here and talk a little bit more of the how-to around collective impact. So Jen set the stage for defining what collective impact is, how we've seen some common patterns come up when we've looked at effective cross-sector collaboration through this collective impact lens. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the how here with these principles of practice. This was really informed by a lot of feedback that we got after the original collective impact article came out in 2011. There were a lot of questions around, we understand the definition of collective impact, but we want more around the actual implementation of it. And I won't talk through all of these in detail, but a couple of these I wanted to put a finer point on both this slide, but also on the slides to follow. So first, around the importance of equity, we're seeing a lot of implementation around collective impact. It's essential to think about designing and implementing the initiative with a priority placed on equity. And just as Jen mentioned a minute ago when she was defining the common agenda, she gave that example of initiatives sometimes will very explicitly call out an opportunity or an achievement gap and really make that part of the work. I'll talk a little bit more about equity on the following slide. The number 2 here is also super important around including community members in the collaborative, and this often goes beyond just providing the episodic opportunities for feedback, but truly providing opportunities for those with lived experience to actively engage in the work. So we've seen examples where you have parents and family members and other community members serving on the steering committee and or working groups. We'll talk a little bit more in a minute about the structure of collective impact and ways that you can provide opportunities for community to have a voice, but that's a really important one. I'll just speak to 2 others on here, and there's a whole set of resources we could point you to on all of these, and we probably will have follow-up conversations around a lot of these. But another one that I think is super important is this focus on program and system strategies. We often get the question of, how is collective impact different from other forms of collaboration? And one thing that is unique about collective impact is that you're not just trying to scale or coordinate maybe 1 or 2 programs. You're really trying to get at root causes. You're trying to change the system, which gets into things like, how do you shift policies? How do you change people's mindsets around poverty, around racial inequities, around name the complex issue or issues that you're working on? So that one is a really important one. It's a combination of both. You want to think about program strategies, but also system strategies. And then this number 8, I think, is another one I'd put a finer point on for customizing for local context. Sometimes we find that people are very eager for a rigid roadmap or set of steps that they can follow, and I would say collective impact is best thought of as, a set of guiding principles that you then need to make sure works in your community, and it's not this linear set of steps. These are some principles that you can keep in mind, but you need to be, honoring prior collaborations that might have come before you. You need to think about existing relationships that you want to build upon. You want to think about those with lived experience. These are all things that fall into the local context category. So as I mentioned on that number one principle of practice, equity, I wanted to talk a little bit about how we've seen equity woven throughout the 5 conditions of collective impact. And this is an example from a great blog that you can see noted here on the bottom about bringing an equity lens to collective impact. And I'll just speak to some of the highlights here, but this is informed by some collective impact work in Oakland, California that also we're seeing a lot of other communities think about. So again, thinking about the 5 conditions and how you can bring an equity lens throughout, as Jen mentioned and as I was touching on before, think about ways that you can identify a common agenda, which would be defining the problem and what success would look like by truly getting at disparities. So we've seen collective impact efforts really hone in on the importance of addressing disparities and not just having a broad goal, but a very specific goal that's focused on inequities. Shared measurement, this is another area where we've often seen collective impact initiatives go through the process of disaggregating data to look at differences by neighborhood, by income level, by race, obviously. But there are other ways that you could disaggregate data to really get at where is the most important area for us to focus in our collective impact effort. Third, going through these 5 conditions and how equity plays out. So with mutually reinforcing activities, this is certainly related to what I was saying about the common agenda, but if you identify a goal that is focused on reducing disparities, not surprisingly, you want to think about what are those activities that would actually really get at that would overcome those barriers. So this is another way you can think about being vigilant about equity throughout your collective impact effort. Fourth is continuous communication. So we've seen examples where collective impact efforts have been really thoughtful about if, for example, I'm aware of a obesity prevention effort in South Texas where they've been very thoughtful about information that's conveyed not only in English but also in Spanish, given the population in South Texas, or thinking about the spaces in which you are providing opportunities for the community to provide feedback. So changing up the locations, changing up the times of day, having different organizations facilitate those conversations, using trusted brokers, information brokers in the community. All are things that can help with this important notion of co-creation and building trust and opportunities for the community to engage. And then the backbone can also be very thoughtful about equity. So there's ways that the backbone can build credibility by having a listening posture, by really working closely with those that have the trust and relationships in the community, building that trust and relationships themselves. And I've seen examples, like I was in Tennessee recently where there was an entire full-day training that some local funders had supported to help build the backbone leaders' capacity in that state around racial equity in particular. So I've seen that increasingly happening where backbone leaders themselves, along with their partners, are looking for ways to build their own capacity around equity. I'm also going to talk a little bit in this kind of theme of the how-to of collective impact. We get a lot of questions about how you structure collective impact, so I'm going to speak to this slide briefly. Then Jen's going to come back and talk about how this is playing out across a lot of issues, and then we're really excited to hear a little bit about an example through your network in Philadelphia. So let me just speak to this slide, and I'll pass it back to Jen for one other set of reflections before we get the case example in. So if you think about your work, you can envision an ecosystem of partners, and these circles could represent different organizations, residents that have some level of connection already. You might have 2 organizations that in your community are already partnering, or maybe there's even 3 or 4 that are connected loosely. And I would not necessarily call that collective impact, but it could be well-intentioned and necessary collaboration. And typically with collective impact, you usually see a steering committee that is formed with support from a backbone organization that could be housed within 1 or potentially 2 organizations. The steering committee really provides oversight. They're helping get agreement on the common agenda. They're working closely with the backbone to make sure that you're being thoughtful about bringing in other community perspectives. And then usually the way that other community perspectives are brought in is that there are often work groups that form around specific priority areas. So just to make this more concrete, I've been doing some work. I live in North Carolina. I've been doing some work with some literacy collaboratives in the Raleigh-Durham area, and there's one in particular that has the backbone that is actually sits within the school district. So they've raised funding privately to have a position within the school district to play the backbone role. They have a steering committee that's a mix of school district, library, nonprofit, community member perspectives that's helped set the agenda around improving access to improving third grade reading levels in this specific county. And now they have 3 work groups that have formed to really drive forward towards that strategy, and the 3 work groups are around summer learning loss, attendance, and so summer learning loss, attendance, and school readiness. So there's work groups that are formed around those 3 areas, and each of them have chairs that are working closely with the steering committee and pushing the work forward. So that's typically how you see the work structured. With the point here is to find ways to structure the work for intentionality and uncertainty so that decision-making isn't just housed within one organization. It's not a top-down approach. It should be something that really is engaging a wide set of stakeholders in the community. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jen. I'll just go ahead and advance the slide, Jen, so you don't have to worry about it, just to talk briefly about how this plays out in different social issues, and then I'll transition the slide on from there.
Great. Thank you, Robert. So as you can see here, we have seen collective impact initiatives across a broad range of issues, everything ranging from education, workforce development, youth development, to health, community development, and homelessness. We also see, just for your broader context, that this is happening in the U.S. and in Canada, but also internationally. So initiatives using this collective impact frame in places like Israel and Denmark, Japan, China, Mexico, Chile, many different places. And it's very interesting to see how, to the point Robert made, taking this loose idea around the different components and adapting it locally can be applied in the U.S. and overseas. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about a couple examples here before we hear from our colleague at Shared Prosperity Philadelphia. So in the education workforce box, there's an example called Partners for a Competitive Workforce. This is a workforce development initiative in the greater Cincinnati region that's focused on connecting businesses with qualified workers, aligning the education system with the needs of employers, and improving the work readiness of potential employees. And so this initiative was started, 8 to 10 years ago, and they set a goal for themselves that by 2020, 90% of the local labor force would be gainfully employed, and 15,000 more people would be working in in-demand jobs. And if you think about that structure that Robert just laid out, they have a backbone team that sits within their local United Way, and then they have over 150 different participants in that sort of ecosystem of community partners, everything from the employers and workforce boards to the Chamber of Commerce, education providers, and local community-based organizations, and others. And their work is focusing on their different priority economic sectors. So that's how they are breaking down the work into smaller pieces. So pathways around healthcare, pathways around IT, construction, and other issues. Then they have a leadership council. So Robert called that a steering committee comprised of about 40 people. And they have funding to support this work from a few different sources, including their local United Way, other local private foundations, and some national grants as well. So what have they achieved over the course of their work? So since their establishment, as I mentioned about 10 years ago, they've served more than 10,000 individuals across their different 5 career pathways. 89% of those engaged have completed their trainings, 78% have obtained employment, and 67% of those remained employed over 12 months. So those are really promising sets of data, and they're making really great progress in their work. In addition, they've improved wages in their region, and they've served over 750 employers that are in their local region. So that's an example of what this might look like at a very high level in the workforce space. A very different example that I'll give is in the bottom left-hand box, youth development, communities that care. So this is a coalition that is located in western Massachusetts in a pretty rural area over 1.5 counties. It's Franklin and North Quabbin County. And their work started with a focus on reducing youth substance use, and over time has expanded as they have made progress in that area to a broader frame around youth development, reducing risk factors, increasing protective factors, and overall improving the well-being of youth in the region. So they also have an overarching steering committee that oversees the work. Their backbone is a partnership of the county government and a local nonprofit. So they have a few different people, but they sit in different organizations. And then they have a few different work groups that are focused on different sub-components of their strategy. So they have one that's focused on policy and practice change, another on community-based youth programs, another on parent education and engagement, and a few others as well. And that work group level, that's where the day-to-day work is happening as facilitated by the backbone itself. And over the past 10 years, the coalition has reduced binge drinking rates amongst youth by over 50%, and alcohol and cigarette and marijuana use by 33, 33, and 39% respectively. So certainly there were some state policy changes that contributed as well, but in external third-party research, they have really shown the unique contribution that the Communities That Care Coalition in the region has made to really moving the needle for the benefit of youth. So those are two very different examples in very different geographies. Let's move to the next slide, and with that, I'm really delighted to introduce you to, some of you may know, William Hall. Will is the Financial Empowerment Program Manager at Shared Prosperity Philadelphia, the community action agency in Philadelphia. And so with that, let's make sure Will is off mute, and he's going to share a little bit about their collective impact work. Will?
Yes, I believe I'm off mute. Can you hear me?
Perfect, yes.
Awesome. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for having me. So I'm going to talk about our organization and about our strategic plan, Shared Prosperity, which is built on a collective impact model. So the Shared Prosperity is a collective impact effort backbone by the City of Philadelphia's Office of Community Empowerment and Opportunity. That office is the community action agency for the County of Philadelphia. We grew out of a Office of Community Services that used to exist. That agency provided a lot more direct service to folks around benefits access and workforce development and other anti-poverty initiatives. And in 2013, it was restructured and turned into the Office of Community Empowerment and Opportunity, and the methodology for delivering anti-poverty services moved from a direct service model to a intermediary model. The office got smaller, and we worked with nonprofits and other community stakeholders on the efforts that we found important. And the Shared Prosperity strategic plan was built. The office now has an oversight board, which acts as the steering committee for the Shared Prosperity Plan. The Shared Prosperity Plan is built on 5 individual collective impact efforts. So those 5 efforts are around housing security, economic security, food security, early childhood education, and workforce development. Each of those individual efforts, which are under the Shared Prosperity Plan, have their own steering committees with their own common agendas, their own theories of change, their own shared measurements. Moving to the next slide. We've seen some great successes with the last 5 years working under Shared Prosperity. Our workforce development group was able to put together a strategic plan for the city, partner better with our Chamber of Commerce and with one of our local workforce development offices that works really closely with TANF recipients. And through working with all of these different stakeholders, actually came up with a new strategic plan that included making a separate office of workforce development for the City of Philadelphia. And that's now staffed by, I believe, 3 different individuals, and so it's grown, and it now operates as its own collective impact effort that has a much higher profile in the city with regard to meeting the employment needs of under and unemployed individuals in Philadelphia. Also, our housing security working group got really, really good at recognizing the partners recognizing looming issues in the housing market before they became crises. And this built off of earlier work that was done around foreclosure prevention. The same players became part of the Housing Security Steering Committee and working groups, and they noticed over just a few months a real uptick in the number of cases that were being brought where landlords were illegally evicting their tenants. In the state of Pennsylvania, eviction as a judicial process requires a complaint to be filed. Self-help eviction, as it is in most jurisdictions, is not legal and can be prosecuted in and of itself. And so this Housing Security Working Group, like I said, over the course of just a few months started to notice an uptick and really caught a problem before it became a crisis, and was able to elevate it to the attention of some of our lawmakers and policymakers, and what it led to was the creation of an anti-eviction task force that under the mayor's office temporarily, and came up with a set of recommendations and ways to go about preventing illegal evictions in the city and county of Philadelphia. That task force is just about completing its work and will morph back into the Housing Security Working Group under Shared Prosperity. But those are just a couple of the ways where we've seen that by having this really broad network of stakeholders and really having, the leadership and the direction and the the drive for the group come out of those members as opposed to being a more top-down structure. We've been able to see some really great successes. Some of the challenges that we've seen is as a city agency, we're often looked to for funding resources by partners that we work with. And so in building a collective impact strategy, there was, this idea that we would, of course, be a funder as we always have been, but we weren't going to be able to all by ourselves carry the load. And so working to develop a collaborative culture with some of our partners so that way they saw that fundraising and funding the mission and the agenda of the effort to be a shared burden, not just something that was for our office as the backbone agency. It's something that's taken a while, and we've started to see some success there where we work much better on collaborative fundraising, collaborative funding mechanisms with some of our partners around these efforts. We've also seen challenges where, the idea of collective impact, at least for us, one of the benefits we saw is that, as individuals within the backbone agency, within our agency CEO, within that agency, as folks transitioned, the effort wouldn't have to transition, right, because it's just one person who's making that transition. And there have been times where it's been a rough transition, where the key person within the backbone agency who's leading an effort, transitions to a new role or out of that role, and the effort will start to lose some steam. And so having a better shared ownership of that responsibility to see an effort go forward is a lesson we've learned in the first 5 years of running our office on a collective impact strategy, and making sure that as we put together working groups and steering committees that there are multiple individuals who feel the need to, carry the work forward should any one person not be there anymore is definitely a lesson that we've learned. So I guess my next point, that our key lesson learned is to diversify funding and to make sure that you're looking forward in a lot of different areas, and it's not built all on one on one stream of funds, and then also to diversify leadership to make sure that the folks that you're partnering with and who are coming into the effort have as much ownership over it as the backbone agency does. And then also allowing for evolution of the theory of change or need for the effort. We've had some instances where we put together a working group, or we put together a steering committee for one of the initiatives, and there'll be other efforts going on within the county or within the city that seem really duplicative of that work, and so we've we've understood the wisdom in making sure that we're not duplicating those efforts, and to shut down working groups that are duplicative of other efforts, or to bring those efforts within, the collective impact framework that we're working on. And then also, like I said, with the Housing Security Working Group, when they started, residential mortgage foreclosures were really the hot button issue that steering committee was focused on, and the theory of change was built around preventing them or otherwise stopping them after they did get started. And now in 2018, the biggest problem that we're seeing that affects housing security is tax foreclosures and these illegal rental evictions. And so that's required that the theory of change, evolve over time and maybe become more encompassing of all of those different threats to housing security, or just, evolves as the problem that it's trying to tackle evolves. And so, yeah, those are some of the lessons that we learned from Shared Prosperity. We're going into 2019, and we will be starting a new 5-year strategic plan. So I expect Shared Prosperity to get a little bit of a shakeup, but I think we're still really committed to the collective impact model. We've had a lot of success with it, just in terms of being able to accomplish more than we could have if we had a more hierarchical top-down structure that we had prior to Shared Prosperity. And then I advanced the slide a little too quickly. One more thing I did want to talk about, in going through this work within the economic security space, we've also had the opportunity to work in other collective impact efforts where we were not the backbone agency. The Free Library of Philadelphia, which is our public library system, their Southwest branch, their Pascalville branch, started a job readiness lab about 2 years ago now, and they started that as a collective impact effort. And the issue they were trying to address is that that area of the city has a higher rate of unemployment and a higher rate of poverty than the average across the city. And a lot of the folks in the community use the terminals at both the public library there and at one of the community development corporations to apply for jobs and to look for jobs. And the library wanted to better serve those clients by offering them more than just terminal access, but other job readiness services like teaching interview skills, help with resume writing, how to look for a job, where the best place to look for a job is, matching skills to job placement or job training. And so they started up these job readiness labs, and we came in to offer financial education and financial counseling and microfinance services from our economic security partners to that effort. And that's a very small part of what the effort's trying to do in helping people find jobs, but it was seen as important just to help people address credit, as it can oftentimes, depending on the job they're looking for, affect employment decisions. And then as folks do start to see their incomes change, for them to be able to maximize that through our financial empowerment centers was seen as something that was desired. And so the lesson I've learned through working in that collective impact effort that I don't think I would have gotten just serving as a backbone in ours is just the different role that the backbone plays versus the other individuals within the effort. And what I mean by that is that as a backbone, I'm sort of constantly thinking about the effort and constantly thinking about moving the agenda forward. As somebody who plays a role in an effort, I'm not always thinking about it. And the person and the entity that is the backbone in that other effort, it has been able to teach me how to keep people engaged and how to keep people moving forward with the agenda that the group has laid out. And it's helped me in doing the same thing with the collective impact effort where I am the backbone. And so it's been an interesting experience being, and then I've learned lessons from both that inform the other, and being both a backbone and being, just a group member in different collective impact efforts. So yeah, that's the experience that we've had in Philadelphia as a CAA working on and in collective impact efforts. And I guess now I'll turn it back over to Jennifer to pick up from here.
Great, and I actually had just a couple follow-on questions for you. Thank you so much for the really illustrative overview and how your work as a community action agency can play different roles, the backbone role, or in many cases also a partner role to other collaboratives. I really appreciate you lifting up both of those examples. One thing I was wondering if you could talk about is how you balance the priorities of Shared Prosperity Philadelphia and sort of the mandate that you have as the local agency with the vision or the priorities of the steering committee, given that the idea is to have the steering committee collaboratively identify the priorities for the collective impact initiative. How do you kind of balance that tension?
Yeah, sure. So this is something that is a current dialogue for me in the economic security space, which is of the 5 pillars. I think it makes sense that that's the one, but just to be clear, that's the one that I'm over. This is an ongoing dialogue for me because our steering committee we currently don't have a steering committee for that, and my rationale for that is that I'm a part of other efforts in the city to set an agenda for economic security that works through different nonprofits in the city, some on a collective impact model, some not on a collective impact model. And I think we're able to accomplish the work of collective impact through being a part of those efforts and helping to craft those common agendas and craft those theories of change without having to have one of our own. And then by operating more independently with economic security through our own work, I can focus on the mandates that we have by being, a city-run community action agency. And so for me, it's about seeing where, making sure that you're honoring the collective impact model and taking the input from the community. And if at any time that runs afoul of the, mission that we're given or the dictates we have by being a city-run CAA, then working that outside of the collective impact model, because I think that so much gets accomplished through the collective impact model that if there are little pieces that you have to do through another means, it's better to do that than to disrupt the collective impact model and turn it into more of a hierarchical thing, which would really not get you the benefit out of it. So that's how, is by seeing where collective impact is going to be able to help us meet our goals and then where it's not. Luckily, it's been able to help us meet 80 to 90% of our goals because the steering committees have been really on board with the dictates we have anyway. We've really seen eye to eye on that. So
that's great. Thank you. Thanks. So we have one question that's come in that I'll pose and we'll take a stab at, but I also want to encourage others on the line to share questions in either the chat box or the Q&A. And those can be for Robert or William or myself. We're lucky to have William on the line as one of your peers to talk about his experience. The question that has come in, and Robert, I'll take a stab at it, and please, others feel free to add as well. So the question is, for data, is there an emphasis on anecdotal data from community members or evidence-based research? These two concepts are often at odds, and how would you honor both? I think it's a super question. Thank you so much for asking it. I think we actually have a later webinar that will be touching more deeply on evaluation and measurement, but so we'll get into it probably even more then. But I appreciate you asking it because it's very important to look at both. So one of the expressions a colleague of mine uses is thinking about when we're looking at data, there are both content experts in quotes, so that those are people who might be very close to the evidence-based research, and context experts, so those community members with the lived experience related to the focus of the work, and needing to bring both of those perspectives and both of that data to the conversation. I think sometimes when they are consistent with each other, the lived experience just really adds much more depth to what kind of solutions will make sense for the community to move forward on the issue. if those are at odds, I don't think there's a silver bullet answer other than needing to work through that. And, you know, when push comes to shove, you know, the initiatives I've seen have truly honored the perspectives of the community member, the person who's closest to the situation that the work is focused on. And so that is definitely a role that the backbone can play, is trying to weave together those two perspectives to think about what needs to be done. But, you know, really honoring the community perspective and lived experience as part of that is incredibly important. Will or Robert, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, sure. I think this is a really great question too, and is really relevant to some work we're doing right now around financial inclusion, where we conducted a community needs assessment, and now we're going through the follow-up process of engaging community members, some of whom were part of answering the assessment survey and some of whom were not, and testing the data that comes out of that. And we do the same thing a lot of times with, you know, evidence either collected from local institutions like our Federal Reserve Bank that have a lot of, you know, really quantitative data on the economic conditions of individuals living in our region, and then testing that around these community conversations. And I would say that the way we oftentimes go about reconciling them is allowing them to inform each other until they do get to a point of agreement. And usually where I see a lot of disagreement is, you know, asking slightly different questions when you ask them through research or through community needs assessment than you do when you're having conversations with partners from the community. And it's really the great thing about having steering committees and working groups already established is that when you want to test out quantitative data through anecdotal evidence, you have regularly planned times that you're already meeting with folks who are already well aware of why you're asking the questions and are already engaged in the work. And so it's a much lighter lift to be able to get that anecdotal feedback and then to go back and, you know, change the research questions or, you know, look at the data differently based on the feedback you got anecdotally. And by ping-ponging back and forth a couple of times, we're usually able to get them into harmony with each other.
That's great. Thank you.
And I'll just add briefly, Jen, that I've seen. I'm aware of a collective impact effort in the Southeast that's focused on economic development, specifically around opportunities for women in the workplace. And I think right now and I've just started working with them. They're in the stage where they've got a lot of content experts, meaning that they've got people who studied the economic development landscape. It's leaders at the community college, it's HR professionals within companies. So they're the right people, but they're missing the voice of the person that they're ultimately trying to serve. So I think they're at the point where they probably are over-indexed on the evidence-based research and the kind of professionals in the room, and they need to think about more of the anecdotal data from the community. So that's one thing. They have a meeting a week from Tuesday where that's one of the main agenda items, just to think about how do you find that more appropriate balance that you and Will were just talking about.
Robert, I'm going to pass it back to you to take us through the next section of our presentation. And again, please feel free to share questions as we're going.
Sounds great. Awesome. And we definitely will have more time for questions in just a few minutes. I'm going to take maybe 5 minutes to talk to a few other slides, and then we'll turn back to any remaining questions that you all have and make sure we give our host today a chance to wrap up as well. So I'd mentioned before that we often get the question of, you know, is collective impact just a synonym for all forms of collaboration? And I wanted to put on a finer point that collective impact really makes sense under certain circumstances. So there's 2 big questions you need to ask yourself when thinking about collective impact and whether it's right. Is first, is it the appropriate tool? There are lots of different ways to partner and collaborate that might not have the level of structure, might not be focused on bringing together cross-sector partners, but there are certain things that you could ask yourself to say, is it the appropriate tool? So one thing you can think about is, do we need to involve multiple sectors, multiple systems? Do we need to bring together business, government, philanthropy, nonprofits, community together? Is it an issue such as the work you are doing around poverty alleviation and other related issues? And the answer is probably yes. You might also say, is the issue such that we need to look at different interventions? So sometimes, as I said before, we have people who might be trying to bring two nonprofits together to work on a common program or to coordinate across their two programs. That might mean that collective impact is not the appropriate tool. You may not need a steering committee and working groups. It's just finding a way to get those two organizations aligned. But if you're trying to really get at systems level change, then collective impact might be appropriate. And you would want to be thinking about, does the issue that you're trying to address impact a significant part of the population? You could define significant in a lot of ways. It could be where there is a significant disparity, or it could be a size of the population. There's different ways you could define significant. But if you answer yes to all of those appropriateness checks, then the second category of questions are, if it's the right tool to use, the right approach to use, is our community ready for it? And there's a couple of readiness factors to keep in mind. One, do you have influential champions? These could be leaders from grassroots organizations or leaders from different sectors who have said, this is something we need to do. We need to form a steering committee to think about this in more detail. So oftentimes you see influential champions step up. And these may not be influential as in a formal CEO role. It could be those who are influential because they have the trust and relationships in a community, even if they don't hold a formal title or role. Another important readiness condition is urgency for change. I'm aware of a violence prevention effort in the Southeast. Again, I'm drawing pretty heavily from things in my backyard today, but I've seen this play out in other parts of the country too. But it's a violence prevention effort that's emerged because they had reached a tipping point with the number of teen-related violence, teen-on-teen violence, and they're really trying to find a new way to address why there's been such a spike in violence in this community. And so they've reached kind of a tipping point where there's urgency to do things differently in a coordinated way. Availability of resources. This is not only financial resources where you typically want to see multiple years that are dedicated from private philanthropy, from local government, from other sources of funding that can support the backbone staff capacity, can invest in the coordinated programs across the partners. So this is the financial resources. It's also human capital resources. You need to see this commitment over multiple years. And then this last piece, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail on the next couple slides, is the importance of having trust and a groundwork to build from where you already have a basis for collaboration. If you've got broken trust and the community's not worked together before, this can be more challenging. So there's some pitfalls to think about, pitfalls to avoid. So you don't want to rush through the common agenda development process. We've seen some collective impact efforts mistakenly think that you could get agreement in 1 or 2 meetings around the common agenda. This often takes more time. I won't speak to all of these. Another one that is a pitfall that I've heard quite a bit about recently is this temptation to self-declare as the backbone. This doesn't always happen, but I've seen examples where someone might out of the gate say, I'm going to play the backbone role without it being a facilitated process where maybe to start for the first couple of months, you might have a independent consultant, or you might have a shared kind of backbone structure before you identify who's going to play that backbone role. But we've seen groups go through an RFP process or actually have a formal set of steps to go through to identify who's going to play that backbone role and to clarify what exactly is the backbone doing and not doing, because it's not supposed to be a power grab. This is a much more distributed, behind-the-scenes servant leader role. And I guess the last one I would point to on this slide is this last one. So for collective impact to really take root and to be effective, you have to see people recognize that this is doing things differently. It's not about coming to the table with your set of programs that you want to keep exactly in place for the next X number of years. You need to see a level of learning and iteration and change. And Will, I thought you provided some really good examples about the ways in which you and your partners have changed as a result of the work that you're doing in Philadelphia. Just 2 other slides before we turn it back for a few more final minutes of questions. A couple of mindset shifts to be thinking about, and some of this just puts a finer point on what we've already talked about today. So we had just to that question about the balance between data from community members and evidence-based research, really these first 2 points speak to that question. So not only focusing on evidence, so what are programs and interventions that are evidence-based, but how do we make sure that we're thinking about the strength of relationships in the collaborative? So this is not just about executing on programs, you got to think about the strength of connections and relationships. As Jen mentioned, making sure you've got content and context experts is very important. This third one, I would say, is one that often can result in a breakdown in momentum around collaboration if you have broken trust. So thinking about ways that you can share credit. I've seen good examples where there might be a different example that you lead off the meeting with a different partner every meeting. So if someone else gets the opportunity to share what they've learned, or it's not just about leading with the backbone as the lead logo, that there's a collection of logos and a collection of voices that you're highlighting. And I mentioned before that collective impact is not just about program-related interventions, it's also system-related changes. And if you have that good mix of program and system strategies, that will lead you to this deeper level of population-level impacts. The last slide that I'll speak to is some of these intangibles for success, and I think all of these are important and build on what we've talked about. So the importance of relationships and trust. One of my colleagues has said that collective impact moves at the speed of trust, and it sounds cliche, but it's so true. And in so many settings, whether it's in health or economic development or education, you really putting trust and relationship building at the center of this work is so important. The importance of having a learning orientation. I've seen great examples where collective impact initiatives have had kind of fail forward moments where they might even start a meeting off with, what's something that's broken or not gone well in the last month among our partnerships so that we can have space to learn and improve. So it's not about placing blame, it's about using that as a chance to learn. I'm aware of some initiatives around the country that are doing a lot around leadership, identification, and development. So having, for example, a learning cohort of backbone leaders and other partners that might meet several times a year across different collective impact efforts to dig into some of these really sticky challenges around equity, around community engagement. So there's a lot you can do to build your community's capacity around some of those principles of practice that I talked about before. And looking for ways to foster connections. This happens between those that sit on a steering committee, from working groups to steering committee, others in the community that might not be in the formal structure but are engaged in lots of different ways. But finding multiple avenues for people to engage in this work is very important. I know we've only got 12 total minutes left, and we want to give time back to our hosts at the community action agencies to wrap up. But Jen, do you want to take a few other final questions before we wrap up?
Yeah, well, I'd like to put in a call for questions if anyone on the line has them. And while we give a minute, I just wanted to give Will the opportunity if there are any reflections based on Robert's comments that you'd like to share. No pressure, but open the floor for you if you're interested. So you might be on mute, or else.
Oh, I apologize.
No problem.
Am I here now? Okay.
Yes.
So, yeah, I liked the comments at the beginning about really asking the question about whether or not collective impact is the appropriate method. You have to be able to have some flexibility over what the common agenda is. If it's somewhat mandated and you're looking for support for an agenda that's, already been decided upon, I think that would go really poorly. And yeah, and just thinking about the extent to which you're able to collaborate and be flexible on, those things dictates to me most strongly whether or not it's an appropriate method. I'm actually going to get done with this call and go into a conversation trying to do a better job with our VITA services here in Philadelphia, and there's somebody who wants to start a collective impact effort around that, and we're going to be asking that very question, is this the right method to be able to do this? I think it's an important question up front.
Yeah, absolutely. And the couple things we think about is, is it the right approach? Is it, is it the appropriate approach? So does the problem warrant this kind of collaboration? And, there are a lot of resources that go into collective impact. So it needs to be kind of a broad enough thing that you're working on to warrant it. And then in addition, is there the urgency, the readiness, and those other factors? So yeah, thinking through all of those are great. A question that's come in, are there any strategies for ensuring all partners are recognized, celebrated, included? Will or Robert want to take a pass at that?
So one thing that comes to mind is I've seen examples where collective impact efforts have done a really good job of using stories and not just having it be, like, for example, if you've got a quarterly or annual report or some sort of kind of update for the community, there's ways that you can use storytelling and lift up the voice of many partners and how you're telling stories about what's working. So I think there's ways that you can design meetings and broader updates to shine a spotlight on different partners who are contributing to the work and not just have it be about the backbone or just about the steering committee. And as you have work groups take root and they're starting to implement the common agenda, I think that's another way that you can celebrate, include, and recognize others in the community who are involved who might not be on the quote-unquote leadership team or steering committee.
Yeah,
and I would just say oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Please go ahead.
No, I was just going to add to that, you know, whatever role you play in an effort, just using your platform to highlight the work somebody else is doing, I think is really important. I think a lot of times, for one reason or another, it's easy to not do that. Whether it's something as simple as if you know, have some sort of a external communication strategy that centers around, like, whether it's social media or press releases or whatever it is, to just from time to time be using that platform to highlight not only your own work but the work of others within the effort, I think can go a long way. And, you know, I know we do an annual summit, and this year I think we're moving in a direction where most of that's going to focus on the work of our partners within these different collective impact efforts, as opposed to our own work, because we really see, you know, being a part of these efforts as, you know, being more important than the things we're doing individually. So I think just using your platforms to highlight the work of others, I think can be really important.
Yeah, I was going to give a similar example. One of the initiatives I've worked with, whenever an inquiry, like a press inquiry on the issue comes into the backbone team themselves never responds. They pass it on, for example, to other partners to do the responding. So just always thinking about how you can elevate partners and their work will go a long way. Do we have other questions coming in? Give a second for others that might have a question that they're thinking about.
And this is Tiffany. I'm just going to fire the question off to you, and maybe you've spoken to this, but it has to do with any insights or guidance that you would offer agencies around sustaining the engagement of the partners in the collective impact effort. Like, is there any additional insight or advice that you would offer around sustaining those relationships or sustaining engagement?
Yeah. Robert,
so
you want to take that?
Will.
And Will? Yeah, great.
Sorry, yeah. This is actually something we've dealt with a fair amount, and for me, it's about, especially when you're starting up and even as things are going along, especially if you're the backbone, is resisting the urge to answer questions about, you know, what the agenda is going to be, what the strategy is going to be, you know, whether it's policies within the effort, just really resisting the urge to quickly answer those questions or to take on that responsibility and pushing it back to the group, so that way they feel a sense of ownership about what's happening, I think goes a long way to keeping people engaged.
I would just quickly say, Jen, the importance of demonstrating results, having quick wins that you can point to that would keep people excited and engaged. Sometimes that can be through trying different prototypes or finding things that can generate feedback pretty quickly, but also keeping an eye on why you're coming together in the long term. So if you don't have a lot of agreement around the common agenda and what you're ultimately trying to achieve, then that can also undermine sustainability. I think another one that we've talked about before as a team, Jen and I have talked about this, is needing to kind of adapt over time. So sometimes that can help with sustaining momentum if you're open to bringing new voices in, if you're actually willing to revisit the common agenda after a year or two, if there's new information that comes in or new partners that are interested in getting involved. So that's another way to you know, keep momentum up with this type of work.
That's great. Well, I want to just say on behalf of the Collective Impact Forum team from FSD and the Aspen Institute, and I will take the liberty to say on behalf of Will from our Shared Prosperity Philadelphia, thank you for the opportunity to present today. Contact information is up on the screen if folks have follow-up questions. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Tiffany.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate it. So this was all great stuff, and we look forward to more information related to this Collective Impact series. And so with that said, very quickly, just want to highlight some resources available to all of you who are listening in today, and that is follow-up related to today's webinar. The webinar recording, the slides will be available on our Learning Community blog. It's lcrcweb.com, as well as the partnership website. Additionally, I would like to point you to our CSVG TTA Resource Center, which is yet another clearinghouse of resources where you can engage in searchable or searches related to specific topics, but pretty much our resources and content is also archived there. Next, this event today is a part of what we call Webinar Wednesdays, as I have specified previously. We invite you to go to the partnership website or the blog for just the updated list of upcoming webinars that occur on Wednesdays, weekly, 2:00 p.m. Eastern Time. The next that I'd like to highlight is, so the Collective Impact Forum, they are serving as the subject matter experts for the results at the community level group, and really will finish out that group's series. So today was the beginning in the series for them. They will come back to us on June 18th, so mark your calendars. They will facilitate a webinar entitled Collective Impact Roles and Developing Your Common Agenda. August 15th, they'll come back and talk about evaluating collective impact. And then September 26th, they will talk about community engagement and equity for collective impact. So please join us for the remaining of the series. Also, for those of you who are members of the Results at the Community Level group, you can also stay connected with the resources and upcoming events on Community Action Academy. If you have not yet set up an account, this slide provides you with information on how to do that so you can remain engaged with the resources, but also your peers in the field want to continue this conversation. Finally, I'd like to thank again the LCRC team, and certainly as you have questions related to this learning community group or anything pertaining to the learning community, our contact information is listed here. Do contact us. We hope you have joined today's wonderful presentation. This concludes our time today. Make it a great day.